Welcome to the first event of the series of online seminars hosted by the East-West Psychological Science Research Center at the Faculty of Psychology, Chulalongkorn University. And we tend to call the center in short East-West Center. And my name is Jennifer Shawanowanid. I'm a lecturer here at the Faculty of Psychology and also the director of the East-West Research Center. So on behalf of our team, I would like to say that we are delighted to launch this series of online seminars. We hope that this will be opportunities for us who are interested in culture and psychology to come together and actually share our academic perspectives and to disseminate our research findings. And at the same time, due to COVID-19, I think many of the conferences have been canceled in the past year. So we really hope that this will be a platform for us to share what we do, and hopefully it could lead to potential collaborations in the future. And I see that many of you here are actually in different parts of the world. So we are very thrilled that this is happening. Before I turn over to two of our guest speakers today, I would like to spend a little bit of time introducing about the East-West Center. The East-West Center is actually a part of the faculty, and it was established at the same time at the Faculty of Psychology, which was about 50 years ago. So at that time, it was established as a response to try to study a distinction between the Eastern perspective and the Western perspective of psychology. But however, as you know, that there are significant differences within the East, and there are also significant differences within the West. Thai culture is different from Japanese culture and Chinese culture, and at the same time, Ecuadorian culture is quite different from American culture. So the aim of the center now focus on a more broader range of topics, including cross-cultural psychology, intercultural relations, and also Eastern perspectives of psychology. And today's topic, which is called Psychology in Ecuador, I think it is a great start for us to look at the non-weird populations in psychology. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the term weird, it stands for Western, educated, I stands for industrialized, rich, and democratic populations. So I think this is a great start for the series of online seminars. So I would like to introduce you to the two excellent speakers that we have today. First, we have Dr. Graham Pluck. He has actually joined us at the Faculty of Psychology for 2 weeks now. He's very new to the faculty, so we are very excited. He got his degrees in Latin American Studies and also psychology in the UK. And he also did his PhD in neuropsychology. And he was a professor in psychology at the San Francisco of Quito University in Ecuador for 8 years. During that time, he directed a research institute at the university and also conducted studies on cognitive ability of street children and homeless adults in Ecuador. So he would talk about psychology research issues in Ecuador. And the second speaker that we have is Dr. Anna Treba. She is an in McLean Hospital, Howard Medical School. She has her degrees in neuroscience and also in clinical psychology. And she has been trained as a clinical psychologist, specializing in CBT and also in mindfulness at Howard Medical School. And I think between 2014 and 2019, she taught psychology courses at San Francisco of Quito University. And at that time, she also provided care to patients in anxiety, personality disorders, and also depression. So today she would talk about clinical psychology related issues in Ecuador. And for each of the speakers, we'll have about 20 minutes. if you need more time, feel free to do so. And at the end of the session, we also have Q&A for about 10 to 15 minutes. So for the audience, if you guys have any questions, you can type in the chat so I can gather all the questions and send it to the speakers at the end of the session. Okay, so I will hand over to Dr. Graham first.
Okay, is the share working okay? Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, yes, so thank you for the introduction. I'll speak first. And I'm a research psychologist, really. And I was in Ecuador for almost 8 years. And at the end, I was directing this Institute of Neurosciences. And we did a lot of sort of neuropsychology research. But the stuff I want to talk about today is more to do with cognition, and in particular in relation to sort of the socioeconomic status in Ecuador. And I'm going to give you a sort of personal view based on the research that I did. But I'm going to use it to highlight some of the cultural features within Ecuador. And just give you an idea about the country, because most of you have probably never been to Ecuador. And hopefully you can learn a little bit about the culture there. Okay. So first of all, I'll just give you an introduction to Ecuador. It's a smallish country in South America. It's less than half the size of Thailand. So it's, it's kind of a small country, but it feels like a large country. Spanish is the most common language spoken, and it lies right on the equator. Okay, in Spanish, Ecuador means equator. It's called the equator country. Okay. It's a very diverse geographical country because it has a large area of Pacific coast. It also has the Andes Mountains running right through it, which means the capital city is at very high altitude. We lived at about 10,000 feet above sea level in Quito. There's also the Amazon rainforest, is partly in Ecuador. And on top of that, there's also the Galapagos Islands, which are in the Pacific Ocean, part of Ecuador. So the cultures are very varied because there's so many different geographical regions. Now, I'm glad that Jennifer mentioned weird, because I'm going to come back to this and use this in some examples. But Ecuador is not a weird country. It's not a Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic country. It's some of those things, but it's not one of the main countries where lots of research comes from. In fact, there's very little research, very little psychological research originates in Latin American countries. Now, what I want to talk about is things like socioeconomic status and literacy, because for me, there was no point in trying to do standard psychological research, doing experimental psychology and things like this. It makes more sense to try and adapt the research to the environment I'm in and the needs of the environment. And for a non-weird country, this means for me is things like socioeconomic status are important. And there's also, I'm going to talk a little bit about the local needs for research and applied psychology to do with sort of scales and normative data. Okay. So, now, the socioeconomics are of interest because Ecuador is a very financially sort of divided country. In Quito, for example, there are many houses like this, $750,000 house in Quito, a very large house, very luxurious. But the majority of people in Quito live in houses more like this, okay? Densely packed, poorly constructed, with limited amenities and limited sort of road access. So there's a big difference between rich and poor. Well, a very big gradient of socioeconomic status in the country. Now, as an example, this is some research we did on adolescents living in Quito. We were trying to correlate socioeconomic status with cognitive ability. And I've just picked out a low SES participant from the database, a 13-year-old male. His mother had no education at all. His father only had primary school education. They didn't own a home. They had no internet, satellite TV, but no telephone, no mobile phone contract, of course no domestic servants, and no electronic devices to study with, such as a computer or even calculators. A high SES participant had all of these things, and very well-educated parents as well. So this is the kind of difference between rich and poor, which is bigger than in the weird countries generally, which is likely to have an effect on cognitive function. And I mean, I'm not going to go into the details of the research. I just wanted to make the point that this is something which can be done in non-weird countries and has an extra sort of value to come from those countries. In fact, we found the correlations between SES and cognition were much stronger than has been recorded in the weird countries. A correlation of 0.7 between language ability and SES. If anyone's done psychological research or reads journal articles, you'll know that correlation of 0.7 is really high. You very rarely find such correlations such large magnitude. So it shows how important socioeconomic status is to sort of psychological development in the non-weird countries such as Ecuador. Now, another feature of Latin American countries in general, and also many countries in Southeast Asia, is what they call the street children. Now, it's not a popular description, but it's used to describe the phenomena of there being children spending a large amount of time in the urban environment, unsupervised by adults. And it's, in Latin American countries, they're usually working children. These are photos I took in Quito. This is a girl who's working selling newspapers, I think she was. She walks around in the traffic selling them through the windows. And this is a boy working as a shoe shine. Shoe shine is common work for boys living in very poor families. Again, this is Quito again. You can see the old Spanish colonial architecture in the center of Quito. And these two young boys working as shoe shines. This is another photo I took in a bar in Quito. And again, a very young child, really. He's been walking around the bars trying to sell chewing gum to people. And this was about midnight. So these working children are putting themselves, or they are in a sort of very vulnerable situation. They're very vulnerable to exploitation, and exposure to trauma, and to abuse. Now, we wanted to see how this might be related to their cognitive development. And we recruited a group of these street children in Quito. And this is my research assistant, Daniel. And he's using this test called the Tower test. And it's a test of reasoning and sort of executive function. It's very difficult. You have to move the discs around and try and recreate the pattern. Okay. So we use that, and we also assessed the children for post-traumatic stress disorder. And then what we found, and the street children generally had low performance on cognitive tests, actually very low. They also had very high levels of post-traumatic stress disorder. And in particular, the PTSD was higher than you would find in even quite trauma-exposed samples in weird countries. In the United States, in very difficult neighborhoods with drug problems and gang problems, even there the rate of PTSD is maybe up to 30% among adolescents. We found 65% in street children. I think this is important because this is a not weird issue. You cannot do this kind of research in countries like the United States where they don't have this phenomenon of street children. It's the type of research which has to be done in countries such as Ecuador. Now, there's some challenges to this. I think all of you probably understand the importance of doing research in not weird countries. But some people did not. And this reviewer, when we submitted the manuscript, the reviewer said, why is there a criticism of most research comes from high countries? What would be the point? And the journal reviewer doesn't understand about the problem of weird and non-weird research. I mean, the issue is that the majority population do not live in weird countries. And this is one of the problems you have trying to do psychological research in countries such as Ecuador. It becomes difficult to publish because of this sort of attitude. Now, the other research priority we had was looking at the validity and reliability of assessments because it's difficult to do research because, again, the journals will always say, well, your scales are not valid and they're not reliable for use in Latin American countries, which makes it harder to actually achieve any published research when you're working in places like Ecuador. And we also wanted to look at normative data, and we also wanted to train researchers to try and improve the situation. Now, one way we did this is whenever we published journal articles, we would include reliability data and, if possible, even validity data on the different scales that we used. To the extent we even did things like to test, retest reliability of questionnaires, and then include that in the articles when we published them. This allowed us to publish the research without getting the criticism by the journals. But also, this means that if anybody wants to use these scales in future in other Latin American countries, they can sort of look at this and show which scales are reliable and which are not. Another feature, the other thing that we did was to try and actually do formal testing, reliability, validity, and publish that itself. And one of the things we did was we created a brief sort of intelligence test designed specially for countries such as Ecuador, which is resource limited. So the test can be downloaded and it can be used in any country, and it's free of use. And we did things like test the Towers test to see whether it really works, whether it's a reliable test for use in countries such as Ecuador. Okay. Now I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Another feature we wanted to try and do is provide normative data. Now, it's a problem for clinical psychologists and educational psychologists in countries like Ecuador because there is no normative data available. So it's impossible to just administer a test and then say whether that score is abnormally high or abnormally low or whether it's average. And it's a very challenging thing to do in a country such as Ecuador. It's very diverse. Okay? I said before, there are coastal, Andean, Amazon, and Galapagos regions. There's also 13 different native languages, plus the dominant language, Spanish, spoken. And there are many different sort of ethnic groups. Majority are called mestizo, and these are mixed heritage of European and indigenous American. There also are Afro-Ecuadorians, of course there are indigenous Americans as well, and another group called Montubio. So it becomes very challenging to even attempt to provide normative data in such a country. Nonetheless, we were foolish enough to try. We tried to get normative data for the WESH adult intelligence scale. And we managed to get about 180 Spanish-speaking participants. But we could only really sample, even with our best efforts, from 4 different cities, 2 in the mountain region and 2 cities on the coast. And we were trying to do all of this on a $3,000 grant, which is the other issue. In countries such as Ecuador, there's very limited funds available for research. So this is one of the challenges, that you have to try and get work done without much funding available at all. Now, the final point, training researchers. Even the professors at universities often have very limited training in research. So we tried to bring in researchers from other universities and try to offer training and show them how to collect data, how to write manuscripts. Particularly, we did this with Riobamba, another city in the Andes, and in Guayaquil, which is the biggest city, which is on the coast. But we also, mainly, we worked with research assistants. Because we have no large research grants in this environment, almost all the research we did was conducted with volunteers. Now, all received research experience, many were included as authors on articles, and many went on to postgraduate study. Now, these are all interrelated issues. The lack of funds really sort of allowed us to achieve more in sort of education because we had to work in this model of doing everything with volunteers. So instead of just hiring a postdoc to collect data, we had to bring in volunteers and train them ourselves. So actually the educational and the limited funds worked together. Okay, now, gracias por su atención, which is Spanish for thank you for your attention. There's different ways you can contact me if you wish, if anyone has any questions after the meeting. But I'm going to finish now, and Anna Treba, who worked with me closely on research, she's going to talk about some of the clinical aspects in Ecuador. And then afterwards, we will have some question and answer sessions with all of us. Okay, so Anna, do you want to take over?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen now. Sorry. Can everybody see my screen? Any problems with that? All right. So, thank you for those introductions, and thank you, Graham. I think that you showed really well what doing psychological research in a non-weird country is like. So today I'll be talking a little bit more about the clinical aspects. So what is it like to be a practicing clinical psychologist, and some of the things that that we worked on in terms of more like clinical training in Ecuador. So I am born and raised in Ecuador, but I came from a background where I was, I was able to go to a school that's bilingual, learn English, able to go study abroad in the U.S. So I did all my undergraduate and graduate studies in the United States. So I kind of have the view of both worlds, right? Unlike Graham, I'm born and raised in Ecuador. So, I think I have a lot of insights into what it's like to be in Ecuador, but I fortunately had the opportunity to study abroad as well. So that really helped in my training, and also I think helped when I went back to Ecuador to teach for the same time, the same window that Graham was also there. That's how we met. to kind of give back and really try to develop some programs to train students in clinical work. So I got my PhD, as I was describing, from Southern Methodist University, and then I did my internship at McLean here in Boston, and now I'm currently working at McLean. But then I taught from 2014 until 2019 at Universidad San Francisco de Quito. Graham, you did a really good job of describing what Ecuador is like. This is a university that is for, I would say it gives a lot of scholarships, but on average it would be for affluent students. And so we have a lot of foreign professors like Graham that teach at a very high level. And we have a big percentage of PhD professors, which is not something that happens at all universities. In Ecuador, there's a scarcity of people that have a PhD level of training in psychology. And at a university like Universidad San Francisco, we're fortunate enough where we do have a bigger portion of our professors have a PhD. So one of the first things that I discovered when we got to Ecuador, and Graham, I think you saw the same thing, is that a lot of the psychologists that were practicing as clinicians in Ecuador did not have a postgraduate degree. So in Ecuador, unlike in many weird countries, you can graduate with an undergraduate degree and practice psychology. So part of it is because since it's not a liberal arts education, you sort of go in right from your first year. You get intensely into psychology and you train in that for 5 years. To become a clinical psychologist, instead of it being a 4-year degree, it's a 5-year degree. And then you can graduate and practice as a psychologist. Now, at Universidad San Francisco de Quito, since it was a university that was modeled from the U.S. and other European countries, it is a liberal arts education. So students did have to take courses of common curriculum on top of, their psychology major. So really, it wasn't enough training to really say, you're eligible to treat patients right off, undergraduate studies, because there's not enough years of training, in terms of really that training that you only get from practicing and really having patients in front of you and getting supervision. So I really found it very problematic that people were graduating from their undergraduate degree and just going directly into clinical practice, because you really don't see this in other areas of the world and other in weird countries. And there's a reason, right? So I think that just ethically and in terms of how much training you have right off the bat when you graduate from your undergraduate degree is just not enough. And so with other professors, we formed a master's program at Universidad San Francisco de Quito. It was one of the first master's programs in clinical psychology in the country. Because this is the other piece, is that the reason why a lot of people in Ecuador do not have a master's degree or a PhD in clinical psychology is that these programs do not exist. So I know that I just said, I don't think it's really ethical for people to be practicing right after your undergraduate degree. But at the same time, we wouldn't have any clinical psychologists because we don't really have programs to train people at a master's or PhD level. So it is a conundrum, because what you would essentially be is forcing people to go abroad, and not everybody has the resources to go abroad and study to get their master's or PhD. So we felt like this was a huge step into giving additional training to people so that they could practice in a more ethical way and provide better services, but also being more, giving them like a real opportunity, because it's not feasible for everybody to just study abroad. So this was a program that we developed that was a scientist practitioner model. It was modeled to be just as strong in terms of clinical work as well as research. So this is a typical program in the US would have this sort of model. And the idea was that we would train people also to understand the research aspect, to understand what clinical trials are like, so that when they're practicing clinically, They also understand the importance of empirically supported treatments and clinical work, because this is the other piece that I would see a lot in Ecuador, is that a lot of people are practicing, but they're practicing old psychology, like very Freudian or young approaches to psychology. And not that that is inherently bad. The problem is that there wasn't a lot of evidence-based treatments being disseminated in Ecuador. And I did find that a little problematic. Like, I had a couple of OCD patients that were, I think, very, what's the word I'm looking for here? Like, I guess they were in a very disadvantaged situation because they were receiving psychotherapy that was not evidence-based. And I do think it created harm for these patients and made their OCD worse. So I think that this was a key piece for me, was to start disseminating more evidence-based practices that were not just Jung or Freud, which, you know, again, some people mix this into psychotherapy, but I do think that cognitive behavioral approaches are very important to start disseminating in a country like Ecuador, where psychology really had stayed stagnant for, you know, the better part of more than 50 years since Freud developed his theories. So we felt like this was a really good step into giving people that sort of training. But it was a struggle, because even having people understand the importance of evidence-based treatments was hard. A lot of people get into this sort of attitude of, well, my preference is Freud or Jung. Like, that's, you know, I like their theories more. And having them understand that when you're a practitioner, when you work clinically, you can't really base your clinical practice or your approach on what you prefer, what your preference is, but rather what's the research saying is best for your patient. So having people understand that you can't just say, you know, this is my preference, or this is my favorite sort of theory, and this is what I'm passionate about, is not as important as what would better serve the patient. What does the evidence say that works best for an OCD patient or a patient that's undergoing depression? So that was sort of a challenge. And I think a lot of people felt that I was minimizing or minimizing the work of other psychologists. But I was trying to make them understand that, you know, it doesn't come to, it's not me trying to impose a new view. It's more what's best for the patients in the long term. So that was a little hard. But I think that, you know, giving several courses, and Graham also helped me a lot here through his courses, really trying to get people to understand that, you know, when we're saying this treatment is better, it's not because it's dogmatic, you know, or I'm trying to impose another view. It's really what the research is saying is best. It's not anybody's preference or me trying to impose, you know, a weird standard on our country or something like that. It's more, this is what the research says. The other thing that I started doing at the clinic at Universidad San Francisco de Quito is offering Dbt and Act Groups, as well as individual therapy. A lot of these protocols were inspired from my work at McLean. We adapted them to Spanish and Ecuadorian culture. So this was really helpful. And for those of you that are not familiar, DBT stands for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy, and ACT stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. So these are both third wave CBT sort of treatments. Because this is the other piece. I saw a lot of borderline personality disorder in Ecuador. That was one of the main patient populations that I would treat. And there were not a lot of DBT therapists. There was a lot of misdiagnosis with bipolar disorder, which, to be fair, is very hard at differential diagnosis. So that was something that I worked on a lot while I was in Ecuador. And then in 2017, we had a big earthquake hit in Pedernales, which is in the coastal area of Ecuador. It was a 7.8 on the Richter scale. It really decimated that whole area, these cities in general. And what I did with another colleague was offer free workshops on PTSD treatment, specifically exposure and response prevention for PTSD. Because again, this is what, you know, more evidence-based approach to PTSD. So these are the sorts of workshops that I would offer. I offered Dbt workshops as well. And usually we're open to the community. And really the idea was, again, to disseminate evidence-based practices to a wider audience. And the people that attended these were clinicians. So this wasn't really open for patients. It was more for clinicians to learn different treatment modalities so that they can then go to their own practices and sort of start practicing this on their patients. I also went to the coast and disseminated some more there with local psychologists and also directly seeing patients in the coastal area where people were, impacted by the earthquake. I also worked in Neuroquito. This is my private practice, so I saw a lot of patients here. I had a sliding scale. So what I did, for those of you that are not familiar with what a sliding scale is that patients that had more money, I would charge a certain price. And then people that didn't have the resources or the income to see me or to pay that, elevated price point, I would give them a discount rate, depending on what their means were, so that, more people got treatment. And I treated patients that had anxiety, depression, borderline personality disorder, and some geriatric patients. Because I worked with a neurologist and he just, referred me a lot of these patients. And so one of the things that I observed in our culture, which is a little different from what I observe here in the US and I'm sure it's similar in other weird countries, is that patients in Latin America have a lot more stigma towards mental health issues. And what this leads to is a lot more somatization. So patients would present with pains and aches, but really what was underlying all that is either depression, anxiety, a personality disorder. It seemed to me, and this is a conjecture I'm making, is that for a lot of people, it was safer to say, what I'm having is like IBS or like a stomach issue, or my problem is medical, because there's less stigma around that. So it was almost like they were, and it wasn't that they were making it up. I think it was a true somatization presentation of their illness, but I think it's in part also our culture that makes it so, like for example, this neurologist, Nelson Maldonado, who is this tall man here, he referred me a lot of his patients because a lot of them present or go to medical doctors like a neurologist, not even a psychiatrist, but a neurologist, because it seems less stigmatizing to do that. So before even thinking that they have a psychological condition, they'd rather go to a medical doctor, and think, there's something, wrong with my brain, or, I have like these weird sensations in my legs and maybe it's neurological, rather than thinking it might be a psychological issue. So there was a lot that I had to do around psychoeducation so that people understood, that having a psychological diagnosis is just like having a medical diagnosis. They're equally valid, and there shouldn't be so much stigma, but of course there is around mental illness, that the brain is just another organ, and that there shouldn't be this much hesitation towards seeking treatment. Because again, it's not less valid than having a medical condition. It's not something you control. No one decides to wake up and be depressed. It's not something you control. It's something that just sort of happens. Sometimes it's different things that trigger it in your life that all come into like this perfect storm. So there was a lot of that sort of dialogue with my patients and sort of reacquainting them with what psychotherapy is like and helping them through that sort of stigma that surrounds mental health. And I think a lot of the workshops that we did and a lot of the talks that we had also helped in terms of, the more you talk about mental illness, the more it reduces the stigma. And then with my adolescence patients, I had to work a lot with parents that had a lot of issues around, again, stigma around mental health, very invalidating towards their children. So they had, for example, I had parents that had patients, their sons or daughters had depression, and they would say, you're being lazy. That's the problem. You're not focusing on your schoolwork. What you need is more discipline and more structure. And so really educating them on like, this isn't laziness. This isn't that your child, doesn't want to work or is being a brat. It's really, they're struggling with severe mental illness. So those sort of things were really key, I think, to helping patients, families, and the broader community to better manage mental health. Because there's a lot more stigma than there is in weird countries. In weird countries, there's already tremendous amount of stigma around mental health issues, but there's a lot more in countries like Ecuador. I think it's a lack of education. A lot of our treatments are backwards. So, the worldview on mental health is very, sadly, very stigmatized. And then the other piece that I'm still developing is online courses in Spanish. I do find that there is very few resources, and that's another barrier, just like Graham spoke about in terms of research. In clinical work, there's also a tremendous barrier in terms of language. So there's not as many materials in Spanish for clinical work, for DBT skills, for CBT skills as there is in English. A lot of the books are in English. So when I try to, give parents books so that they get better acquainted on what borderline personality disorder is and, skills work, a lot of it's written in English. And this is a huge barrier for people that don't speak the language. So that is something that I think is a future direction to disseminating more evidence-based practices, is really translating a lot of these materials and doing more in Spanish. I think that that's a big piece. And with this, I also, developed my own social media platforms to sort of disseminate more things in Spanish, more of these ideas of small little things on psychology so that people get a better understanding of mental health issues, what are some good resources that can help with these issues, what sort of clinicians or psychologists should be seeking if they have depression, anxiety, OCD, etc. And that is it. So I guess we can open it now to questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Anna, and also Dr. Graham. Does anyone would like to ask questions? Okay, I do get a question, so I'll just read it out for you guys. Have the university and the government been giving this issue more attention since the initiatives by the professors to develop the field, both in research and in practice?
I think Anna probably knows this better. She probably knows policy in Ecuador better than me.
So, one of the things, and I think that this is something that I will go back at some point to Ecuador to do, is that I would like to work with the government in creating some sort of licensing board so that there's a little bit more oversight on clinicians that are practicing. So even if they only have a undergraduate degree, because again, since there's only a few master's program in Ecuador, we can't really expect all of the graduating clinical psychologists to go to those 2 master programs, I think, that are available and become practicing clinicians. So coming up with some sort of licensing board. This is something that we see in weird countries, right? Like in the US, you have a licensing board, in the UK, et cetera, in Canada. So coming up with a structure like that would be amazing. But up till now, the government hasn't been very open to sort of restructuring some of these areas, these gray areas where people are just practicing without any oversight. So I think that that is something that I would like to work on. And in terms of the university did open up. So they were the ones that said, okay, with a couple of professors, we were like, we want to form a master's program. And they were like, yes, let's do this. Let's form the master's program. They were also open to hiring new professors. Now, where we sort of get into an impasse with the university is that there were professors that were doing things that were not that ethical. And it was hard for the university to really understand, this is not ethical practice, and maybe these professors should not be practicing here at the university or be teaching. That piece was a little harder for them. But new hires and such, to an extent, they were open to listening to our to how we saw it. Like these are new hires we should do so that we expand, our program in a way that is evidence-based, and we're getting, the sort of professionals that we need to train our students in that way, rather than professors that, we're from non-evidence-based sort of lines of practice. There was a lot of that. So.
Just a quick question to continue to your thought. Would you see like the same challenges within other subfields within psychology too? Like, for example, like counseling psychology. Do they face like the same challenges?
Yes. And I think like in Ecuador, actually, there isn't really like a counseling degree or a social worker degree. It really is all like clinical psychology lumped together. So that's another thing that I think would be kind of neat if we could sort of develop these different branches, right? But that's more sophisticated, and in Ecuador, things are still very rudimentary in terms of that.
Okay, I have a lot more questions, so I'm gonna move on to the second one. So the next question is that as an Ecuadorian physician, I have witnessed the stigma about mental health, as Dr. Anna said. So as healthcare providers, what can we do to eliminate this stigma?
I mean, this is an excellent question. I think, the more we talk about it, the better. It's sort of like, it should not be like, from the Harry Potter series, like Voldemort, the one that we don't talk about. Because like the thing is, when we don't talk about it, there's more and more misunderstanding and misinformation out there, because people just consume sort of media portrayals of mental illness, which are very skewed and biased. And I think the idea we get is that it sort of becomes every family's dirty little secret. No one talks about it. And so no one gets really the support or validation. Whereas when we're talking about it more openly, people are like, oh, this is more common than I thought. And it sort of normalizes that most of us at some point are going to struggle with mental health. It's just a fact. It's just like physical health. Like we all end up at the doctor at some point, and mental health is the same. But if we're not talking about it openly with family members, et cetera, like we do, when we have a physical condition, we're usually very open to talking with other people about it. When it comes to mental health, rightly so, we're more hesitant. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's, there's a lot more stigma, right? So I think that, learning to talk about it more just allows other people to be like, oh yeah, I also, suffer from that. And it creates spaces for, validation, support, etc. So I think that, the more we talk about it, the better.
So I'm not really a clinician myself, but just to add to that, I think social media is a good way, which it does address this issue. People are often more open on social media and they're more likely to say that they're having issues. And also, the people like Anna has been very good in using social media to send messages about mental illness and about psychology. And Anna, how many followers do you have now?
I have like more than 22,000 on Instagram.
Yeah.
Close to 50,000 on TikTok. Yeah.
Yeah, and she does a lot of stuff on mental illness. And I think that kind of approach is actually very effective in countries like Ecuador.
Yeah, I agree. I found it was. Yeah. Yeah, I think social media is a great way of getting to people because it's, people don't want to read long text. The only problem with it, of course, is that you can't get into any nuanced issue. So you tend to overgeneralize to a crazy extent. Certainly very different from academic writing, right? But I think that the idea, you sort of try to balance trying to get to as many people as possible, even if this means that you're a little less accurate and precise because you have to be short and, to the point. So, but I think I agree with Graham. I think people are a lot more open and it sort of puts that issue out there. So what I've seen in my social media accounts is people are struggling sort of silently with their mental illness, but when they see a social media post that sort of resonates with them, they sort of consider, maybe I should seek help because it seems like I do have an issue here and like this resonates with me. And instead of suffering silently, they might ask me, do you think I should see a professional? This is what and of course, I don't really offer much psychological advice through social media. These are not my patients or anything like that, but it can sort of help them guide them to the right channel so that they get a professional evaluation and help.
Okay. And do you think like cultural faiths or beliefs contribute to like this stigma too? Because I see like some similarities between like Ecuador and Thailand. So.
Yeah, definitely. I think culturally we put like the medical stuff as, the first thing, and then all the other stuff is sort of you made it up, it's in your mind. And then if we mix that with machismo, like the chauvinism that we have in Latin America, there's also this sort of stereotype of the hysterical woman, you know what I mean? Like, like what you see in soap operas. And so there's tremendous amount of invalidation towards women, like, and you see this also in weird countries where it's like, are you on your period? But it's more extreme in Ecuador, I would say. Whereas this like, this is how women are, like they're so hormonal or whatever. And so there's a lot of that mix as well. And it's a bad combination that creates a lot of stigma, a lot of invalidation, being sort of, and this is the thing, and this is what I tell a lot of people in Latin America. It's better to have a diagnosis sometimes. I know people think that this is going to create more stigma and is going to sort of pigeonhole you. But actually, when you don't receive a diagnosis culturally, in Ecuador at least, you get labeled other things like, you're hormonal or whatever. Whereas when you have a diagnosis like BPD, people understand, oh, this is a condition. It's not just you being a crazy hormonal woman or whatever. So I think that this is important, but there's a long road to go. There's a lot of cultural things with chauvinism. Our patriarchal society is more extreme, I would say, than it is in other weird countries. So there's a lot of that as well.
Okay. We have a few more questions. This one we have, when you said the protocol in therapy is adopted to Spanish and Ecuadorian, could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So when we adapted it to the Spanish language, there are certain terms that don't translate as well. And so some of it was trying to figure out like what's culturally, like the most appropriate way of sort of translating that. And then there's also, when you're going through these different therapy modalities in DBT, there might be examples and things that I might change so that they're more culturally kind of aligned with Ecuador. So, like, for example, even like, there's certain treatment modalities. So in DBT, there's certain parts like in distress tolerance where we talk about like maladaptive coping. There's certain like, substance abuse issues here in the US that are not as common in Ecuador. Like, for example, here we talk a lot about opioid abuse. That is not such a common problem in Ecuador. There are other maladaptive coping going on in Ecuador that, are more common just culturally than in the US. And so little changes like that, where I won't be talking extensively about opioid abuse in a country like Ecuador where it's not as commonplace. Yeah. There's more of an alcohol issue and, more cigarettes and other sorts of issues.
Okay. And I think this is a relevant question. How does COVID-19 affect the mental health of the people in Ecuador? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you were in Ecuador during the time when the COVID-19 hit, but maybe you could share something.
Yeah, so I think I can just because all my family's there. And I also did several workshops and seminars over the course of COVID. I think it's impacted tremendously mental health for various reasons. And so the quarantine was, I think, more extreme than it was in weird countries in a lot of ways, especially the US. I can't speak to all countries, right? But And in part is because in countries like Ecuador, we sort of depend on social distancing because we don't have the technology or the medical capacity to treat patients like you do in developed countries, right? And so I think the quarantine fatigue is more extreme. Like, for example, schools have been closed a lot longer than they have here in the US. And so for parents that are trying to work at home, raise their children, and keep, their sanity, I think in Ecuador, it's been a lot more extreme in that respect. And then there's a lot more anxiety, like right now around the vaccine, for example. There aren't vaccines in Ecuador. Like, the healthcare workers have gotten their vaccine, but no one else. And so people are scrambling to see if they go to another country to get the vaccine. And, there's a lot of anxiety around that. And then, of course, people that land in the hospital, there's a lot of concerns about not having enough respirators or, the medical staff. There was a tremendous amount of death in Guayaquil, the coastal city. They've done some reports finding that, it's one of the hardest hit cities, I think, in the world. And so there's a lot of just, the grieving process of just a lot of death, I think, in general in our countries, which is very unfortunate. So I think that those are some of the unique struggles on top of, quarantine fatigue, the fact that we're socially distancing, we've lost structure, all that already contributes to depression, anxiety. But that's in all of the world, I think.
Okay, I have a question for Dr. Graham. What advice would you give to students who want to get involved in psychology research?
I would say try and find someone who's doing research and volunteer. And the easiest way and the best way to learn about research is just being part of the research, and it's also a really good way just to learn more about psychology. If you do research, you learn in a very deep way, and if possible, the easiest way to achieve that is to find an active researcher and contact them and say, do you need a research assistant? And if you're available, if you have time to donate, they may well have something you can do for them. And you can learn valuable skills in that way. I did that when I was an undergraduate student. I helped out in a neuropsychology lab. And when we were in Ecuador, we did this all the time. I had maybe sometimes 6 or 7 assistants working for me. And maybe they were only sort of given 3 hours a week sometimes. But they were all contributing to the research. And some of them, they developed a greater interest in psychology and in research. And many of them went on to postgraduate study, and some of them are doing PhDs at the moment. So I think that'd be my advice. Just try and find people who are doing research and help them. Is that okay?
Yes. I'm not sure if Dr. Anna would like to add anything or.
No, I think that's perfect. I think that's the best way to go. Really.
Yeah, I think you did the same, didn't you, Anna?
Yes, I did. Yeah, that's the way I did it. Yeah. And, and this is another piece, like it can be research. I mean, hopefully it's research that you're interested in, but really any research experience is good. So don't hesitate to latch onto any research opportunity that comes up. Like if the ideal person that you wanted to work with, it didn't pan out, any research opportunity is going to further your CV and help so that you can further your career in clinical psychology. Like I did research in like various bacteria and like weakly electric fish. Well, I was studying neuroscience, right, as an undergraduate before I went to do my graduate studies in clinical psychology. But what they want to see is that you have done research and, understand what it's like and understand the scientific method. You understand what the scientific processes entails, and like in terms of creating posters and what writing a paper is like. That's what they're most interested in. So it's better if it's aligned with what you want to do, of course, in the long term. But it's better to have some research experience than none at all. So.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have more questions? So in case someone would like to ask.
I do. Sorry if I don't turn on the video. It's maybe not in a presentable more at the moment. So maybe sound only might be better. But let me know if you can't hear me properly or accurately. So when you describe, like psychology in Ecuador, if I don't hear the name of the country, I thought that you were describing, psychology in Thailand or the status of, psychology or clinical psychology or mental health in Thailand. So while I was listening to what you say, I was trying to think of, like two countries who are quite, far away. And of course have different or unique culture in their own way. But at the end, they sort of shared this, stigmatization on mental health, or, when you talk about clinical psychologists like graduating from undergrad level, because we don't have many master degree or higher, like or doctorate degree in clinical psychology here. So it's kind of similar in some way as well, although we have, but very few, or mental health in general. So then I was thinking of, what make our countries share these similarities. Is it about, SES, like socioeconomic status, because both are developed country, developing or underdeveloped or backward in Thailand, maybe worse now, but or is about, I'm not sure in Ecuador, but in here, some people describe this as maybe is collectivistic culture that, you need to save family space, so not talk about mental health. Or like education as well, like lack of education. So I think, I want to hear from your opinion of what do you think that makes both countries share these similarities?
I mean, I think that you have some great insights there. I think there is extreme, so we're not, I think, well, I can't really speak because I'm not an anthropologist, but I think we are also collectivistics in some ways. Like we're definitely less individualistic than the US. But probably a little bit more individualistic than other countries. So probably somewhere in the middle, but we do have this thing with the family and family reputation. So there's a lot of this sort of, if there's an alcoholic in a family, they're like, oh, that family, even when I met my husband, like my family, who's educated, but they're still like, who are their family members to sort of figure out if this person's good or not, which is weird to me, but that's sort of how it works. And so there is this family reputation thing going on, and an embarrassment over people that have or struggle with these things. And so I think there is a piece to that in the stigma, but there's also, the lack of education is a big piece. And I think there's also the socioeconomic situation that I think both countries share. And that, so the fact that we're like lower on the socioeconomic scale makes it so that there's less opportunities to further your education. You want to go directly into working so that you can make money, right? But then, there are also no infrastructure. Like there's the higher education, there isn't enough master's programs to really further your knowledge. So it's a multi, I guess, pronged problem that we have in our countries. I think we would have to start with creating more master's programs, right? And disseminating more information, I think, is the only way to sort of improve on this. And at minimum, getting some sort of licensing board where we're at least testing people to see how they're practicing their psychology, for there to be some oversight, because here people have lawsuits against psychologists when they malpractice. In Ecuador, since there's no ethical board, there's no oversight, it's harder to keep people in check when they do unethical things like sleep with their patients or there's so many horror stories in Ecuador. It's crazy. Like there's a lot of good practitioners, but since there's no oversight, there's also crazy abuse. So
if I ask you further about that, do we have time? Because if we talk about like licensing board, right? So we have licensing board for clinical psychology here in Thailand, but not like for counselors. And because I'm a counselor, I'm not a clinical psychologist, and I graduated from the UK, where they don't have licensing board like for a counselor. They have for clinical psychologists, right? And in Thailand right now, we are trying to have licensure for counselor as well. And part of me, if I'm in trouble saying this or not, hopefully not, but so part of me, because Thai culture, we are like power can be easily abused, like, and when we talk about power, it's not just about power of like being a clinical psychologist or being a counselor, like over patients, but also power from people in a higher position as like in the board, right? That they can control, or they can say that this is the only way, you need to follow us. Because in a way, this is how, Thai culture is like, we listen to the people who are in power, whether or not they are right or wrong, we follow them, right? And I see this as the risk that if we give a group of people have some sort of power, and that can be easily abused in the future as well, right? I'm considering the culture that is not quite democratic at the moment, right?
I agree, and we would probably face something similar in Ecuador. Power is easily corrupted. Like, we've had heads of departments in Ecuador that have done some very questionable things, and then no one can remove them from that position. And we're sort of like, they're setting like crazy ethical standards for the students, and it's really hard to navigate that. So I think, you're right. It is a double-edged sword, because once you put people in that sort of position of power, it can also become a huge issue if they're not, if they're abusing that. So I agree.
So what do you think about this then?
So I think what would have to happen is we would have to have like a board, and it would have to be people that rotate. Because in Ecuador, what happens is once they take power, it's like forever. It's like a dictatorship. It's like, I'm here for 30 years. Like, we had a head of department for 30 years, and crazy stuff happened during the course of those 30 years, unchecked, unquestioned, and so I do think that if you have a position that rotates, like, that person has to be out in 2 years. That way you can keep it cleaner, and also having a board. So it's not just one person. And that board would have to, I would say, follow what the evidence-based stuff is saying, like, not just, their preference or, their biases. So something like that could be a solution, but it's tough. It's tough because sometimes, people take power and then no one wants to, people are like, hey, well, you need to leave that position, and they won't. So.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we run out of time, even though like I get more questions. So maybe next time we have to do like 2 hours. But I think the time has come to an end. Thank you so much to Dr. Graham and Dr. Anna for sharing with us your experiences in Ecuador and how psychology is studied and practiced. And also we learned about the challenges that psychologists face in Ecuador. And I see some similarities between Ecuador and Thailand. But we don't really have time to discuss. This is a great start. And thank you so much to both of you. And also thank you to everyone who has joined us today. For those of you who are in Thailand, today is Songkran Day, is Thai New Year, so it's a holiday. So thank you for being with us on the holiday. And for those of you who are outside Thailand, like I said, like, I'm very excited, and I think our team is very excited too, to have people from outside Thailand to come to these seminars and share thoughts and ideas together. Okay, so thank you so much to everyone who is here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.